everyone, Rose here, and I'm back! It's been a little while since I last uploaded a video, and that's because a whole bunch of stuff came up in quick succession. Specifically, I applied to uni a while ago and the entrance exam happened. So that took up my brain cells for a little while, and then I was working on some commissions that I couldn't record or forgot to record early on, so I wasn't able to upload those. So yeah, a whole bunch of stuff happened. But I'm back now, and I've had time to make some art. Specifically, I wanted to make a kind of chill artwork in between all the shenanigans that were going on, so I started work on a painting of Rose, but like tiger-shaped, so a feral version of Rose as opposed to the regular anthro version. This isn't like a redesign that's gonna be replacing my other Rose art. Still gonna use anthro Rose for most stuff, but occasionally I just want like a fully tiger-shaped version. So yeah, that's what I made. This whole artwork didn't end up being nearly as chill as I had planned it to be. I spent a whole lot of time, as you're gonna see right about now, trying out like 500 different thumbnails and sketches to figure out the pose and like the setting and the vibe of the painting. And what makes it worse is that I just ended up going with the very first idea that I had, just with a couple of tweaks. Like for the sketch, if you noticed in the beginning, I made a whole bunch of different sketches and then ended up going with the very first one I had made. And even now for the thumbnails, I make a whole bunch of different sketches of different settings, but then just end up going with like the first, like the vibe of the first one, forest landscape and her stepping out of the shadows. I make some tweaks to the colors and lighting, but the vibe was definitely already there for the first one, and I just spent hours trying out different things for no reason. But I guess that's how it tends to go for me with comfort zone, like personal art. For some reason with commissions, I guess it's just because I already know, like I already have a general idea of what the painting is supposed to be from the commissioner, so I don't have to spend as much time figuring out ideas. I just have to figure out how best to execute on the idea that I've been given. But yeah, let's just make a chill comfort zone painting. Turns out not a very good prompt, because that means I have to use many brain cells to actually come up with an idea for a comfort zone painting. Either way though, at this point I've pretty much decided that yeah, I am going to go with that first idea of her just in a foresty kind of scene, stepping out of the shadows into some like not quite sunset, but almost sunset light. So I decided to make a whole bunch of iterations on that idea, just trying out some slightly different backgrounds and different colors and like different compositions. The composition was quite hard on this one because I decided on the pose before I decided on the setting and before I decided on this cool light thing. The problem is with having her come into the light, that means that only about half of her body is in the light, and that means like the other half is just like faded into the background, not really important for the composition. But since she has her whole long tail, and I wanted all of her to be in the image, I ended up with like a lot of stuff on one side of the image and then very little on the other side. So like the side that had the light in it, which is usually the right side, but sometimes the left depending on when I flip my canvas. But let's just say the right side of the image had the main focal point and had all the light and all the details in it, and then the left side was just completely empty. Like it still had stuff in it, obviously, but it was just pretty much one value and nothing like sticking out compositionally, so took me a bit of messing around with another round of thumbnails before I finally figured out sort of how to make the composition work a bit. what I eventually decided on is to just add like a bush behind her, like a set of bushes, and just have sort of bright light coming through the trees behind that. So there is another big light and dark contrast on the empty side of the canvas. I'm not sure if that explanation made sense, but it's hard to explain it with me flipping the canvas so often. Krita is a very useful feature that you can just press M to flip the canvas and like flip all the reference images and stuff you have too. But the disadvantage of that is that you lose track of which direction is like actually the correct direction of the image, especially when you're trying to narrate over a time lapse. Anyway, I don't think any of the thumbnails was like 100% perfect, especially in terms of that thing I had mentioned with the unbalanced composition. But I had already spent way too much time on thumbnails for what was supposed to be a quick chill painting, and this wasn't something that I could fix quickly and easily enough for me to be bothered. So I just took the thumbnail that I liked the most and started working with that. I just scaled it up and used it as a background and like removed the character and foreground elements from it to give them their own separate layers, or group layers in this case. For the basic flat colors and lighting on Rose, I did the thing I usually do, which is make a group layer with a sketch, a layer for the flat colors, and then a layer for the shadows, which I set to multiply. So that way I can do everything separately to begin with and then merge them down later to do like the final rendering. As you can see at this stage, everything is still very rough. Back when I started painting, I used to be a lot more like precise when it comes to my sketch and my flat colors and making sure my shadows are perfect while I do this whole multi-layer thing. Especially for my sketch. Like, I used to always do multiple layers of sketching, like one very loose sketch for the basic proportions, and then one or even two more refined ones until I had pretty much a line art drawing to then paint with. And then like for the flat colors, I didn't usually have several layers for those, I just did that on one layer. But I always made sure to completely stay within the lines and like fill everything out correctly. Make sure all the patterns and transitions between colors are super precise. But like the more I've gotten into painting, the less clean I do this step, because I've actually found that it helps the painting itself turn out better. Like with a really loose sketch and flat colors like this, I feel a lot more free to make a lot of tweaks to things, even like the proportions and shapes. Much later on in rendering. For example, if you watch the time-lapse closely, you'll see that I changed the face a lot. Like I go in with the liquify tool and just push and pull around things until I'm happy with the proportions and like the expression on her face. And I also tend to end up with a lot more clean, painterly looking paintings, which is kind of ironic. By being extra messy early on, I end up with a cleaner result. But the reason for that is that with a messy sketch like this, I'm forced to go over everything while rendering and like clean everything up, clean up all the lines. Whereas if I make a super precise sketch and everything already has the exact correct proportions and the lines exactly where those edges need to be, I'm not really forced to go over everything and like render over everything. So I end up with lines left over. That all being said, I'm not actually sure I'd recommend like a super messy sketch style when you're first starting out with painting, because that would mean you'd have to figure out all your shapes and proportions and like design details while also figuring out how to paint and render properly, and I think that's a lot to figure out at once. It's a lot easier, I think, to figure those things out in a sketch and then learn to paint in an extra step after that. But like as you go and get more comfortable and get a better feel for how things need to look, merging those steps together and especially reducing your reliance on like lines in your sketch in my experience, definitely going to be helpful for nicer and nicer paintings. And speaking of getting rid of lines, you'll notice that I have removed most of the stripes from Rose. And that is because patterns are a pain while rendering. Like, I wouldn't say rendering a completely flat-colored object is easy, but having any amount of color variation on that object makes rendering like 100 times harder, because if you just have an object with one flat color, then the only differences in color you have across the painting of that object are going to be where the light is and isn't hitting, and like, I guess, the colors of the light. But then if the object has varieties in local color, suddenly you have to manage the light and shadow for every individual color, and you have to make sure they all match up, and it's very annoying. But fortunately, since this is a digital painting, there's ways to work around this annoyance. Specifically, I just, as you saw, removed all the lines and rendered the body without them. And then I added a multiply layer on top of that and used like a pinkish, reddish color to paint the stripes on that layer. That way, since they're mixed in with a multiply layer, they take over the shadows exactly the way I painted them on the flat colors of the body. For light patterns, you would want to use a different blend mode. Multiply only ever darkens stuff, but something like screen would probably work to paint light patterns back onto your lit painting character, whatever. And while we're on the topic of digital painting trickery, I was struggling with the tail, I couldn't really be bothered to paint a rose because those are a bit hard to paint, so instead I just grabbed a royalty-free image of a rose and sketched over that for her tail, which isn't perfect. I don't think the perspective quite fits, or like the pose quite fits, but I could not be bothered to paint a rose. I really need to do some studies for that to like get more comfortable with the shape, because I'm really bad at painting roses for someone whose Sona is part rose. There's a lot of stuff I need to, or probably should, like do some studies for. Roses, like I mentioned, cloth drapery, like folds and wrinkles and all that, some anatomy, some different textures and materials, regular animals, not just furry characters, and even just like plants in general I'm not very confident with. A whole bunch of stuff I want to figure out and get better at. Gotta get into a habit of doing studies and stuff regularly, because right now I use up all my art brain for commissions and things like that. Which isn't too terrible, because I still manage to like improve at stuff and learn stuff in the context of working on an actual finished artwork. I always have a whole bunch of references open so I can like figure out how stuff looks and how stuff works. But there's some things that I have a tendency to sort of brush over or just not do at all, and those things kind of get left behind if I don't specifically go out of my way to do some studies and stuff. Anyway, back to this particular painting. At this point, I'm pretty much done with the rendering on Rose, and I'm moving on to working on the background, and especially working on getting everything to sort of fit together in terms of colors and values especially. For some reason, I struggled quite a lot with the colors on this specific painting, and I'm not 100% sure why, but for a lot of the process I felt like the colors on Rose and the lighting on Rose didn't quite match the colors and lighting on the background. Like they were being hit by a different colored light. I think it might be because of Rose's like red, very bright red details, compared to the sort of very greenness of everything else. I also had a bit of difficulty with the lighting on the trees in the back. At first I had sort of rendered them out more with very visible highlights and shadows, well, not highlights, but light and shadow sort of values, but I ended up deciding on way more like basic silhouette shape for the trees, which is sort of what I usually go for background trees, is just flat cylinderish shapes in front of a like in different layers, and then in front of a relatively simple background. I think this ended up as one of the weaker parts of the painting in general, because it just doesn't have the same level of detail and like stuff in it as the rest of the painting. Because really what you would expect in a forest is there would be more leaves and bushes and like trees of slightly different sizes and stuff like that. And it's a lot of just like empty space, which isn't quite right. The bushes like in the mid-ground and like around Rose in general, I think turned out a bit better. I've gotten a bit of a better feel for like rendering out bushes and stuff like that for some of my more recent paintings, like specifically how to go about simplifying the leaf shape and texture. In this painting I didn't make the different kinds of plants as distinct and like somewhat identifiable as in like the other painting of Rose I made, but I think they still turned out alright. And once again I zoomed in to make tweaks to the proportions of Rose's face. They were almost right at this point, but I wasn't quite happy with how they were. So I used Liquify again to adjust the eyes a little bit, and I added some extra shadows to the bottom of her face, and that got it to where I wanted it, which was good. Around this point in the painting I was pretty happy with how everything looked individually. There were some minor issues here and there, but my main worry was that the colors still felt off. I'd mentioned that a bit earlier, that somehow the individual parts didn't quite fit together. So I went over it with an adjust filter set to levels to sort of tweak the contrast a bit and make sure the different parts had the same amount of contrast and like enough contrast. And I also added in like the extra rays of light to add in a bit of yellow more to the background, since Rose herself is lit with a lot of yellow. And just messed around with different layer settings to try and figure something out that worked. What I ended up doing though for this painting, which is something that I hadn't done before I don't think for any other artwork, is I used also another filter, this time set to gradient map, and went on top of everything with sort of an orange to purple gradient map set to overlay, and then mixed that in with all the individual layers to sort of bring the colors together a bit more. At first I wasn't really particularly sure about whether I liked how it looked with this gradient map on it, but right around this point was when I had to go for that entrance exam for uni, and I wasn't able to work on the painting for a couple of days obviously, and by the time I came back I guess it had just grown on me because I had looked at it for a couple of days. So I just merged that gradient map down with all the layers and continued working on the painting. Obviously at that point, since I had spent a couple of days working on that exam, I had completely lost my train of thought in terms of what exactly I was doing with this painting and like what my plans were, what I still wanted to do. So I really just merged down a whole bunch of the layers that I had and made some final tweaks, fixed some rendering, and added a whole bunch of flowers, especially roses, because you can't have a painting of Rose without a whole bunch of roses. And I just refined it until it resembled something like a finished painting. here's the result. I'm actually quite happy with how it turned out, all things considered. It's not perfect, and I think I actually still prefer the other painting, the Anthro version of Rose, that I made a while ago, the one that I used for my outro. But considering the whole process of its creation, the fact that I didn't even really have ideas in the beginning, and then that I got interrupted and couldn't work on it for like a week, 70% of the way through, I think it did actually turn out pretty good. So if you guys enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe and all that. Now that I'm done with a whole bunch of stuff, I can finally post videos more regularly again, so look forward to those. But that's been all from me for today. If you want to see more from me, I have a link tree in the description below with my commission info, the Discord server, and some of my other social media. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a lovely week, and see y'all next time.